Welcome to Chosen for What, brought to you by the Foundation for Genocide Education. I'm your host, Tommy Schnurmacher. Today's guest is Dr. Benji Goldstein. He's a third-generation survivor whose grandparents lived through the Holocaust. As a child, he didn't fully grasp the depth of their fear or the habits shaped by trauma, but that understanding shifted profoundly later in life, especially in the wake of recent events. Benji, thank you for being here.
My pleasure.
Now, Benji, I want to start by having you tell us about your relationship with your grandparents. Can you share some of the ways their Holocaust experience shaped your upbringing?
Maybe. And it's maybe because my grandparents passed away when I was not very young, but in my teens. And I think a lot of that experience was only processed by me much later in life.
Mhm.
I had two sets of grandparents, and one of them on my mother's side were survivors. And I think there was a lot that I didn't understand about their behaviors. They were always the weird grandparents. And I think a lot of people might have had a similar experience. I lived in Montreal till I was 7 years old with nearby and would visit them frequently afterwards. And they were, like I said, they were the weird grandparents. They were the overprotective grandparents. They were the nervous grandparents. They were the grandparents who did strange things like buckle you in the front seat with them when they drove somewhere so that you were like right by their side. And in hindsight, many years later, I understand that their nervousness and their
Why they did that?
overprotectiveness,
Mhm.
yeah, that was a reflection of their experience. But that was something I only understood decades later, I think.
Yes, I remember when I was first told that, there's such a thing as second gen, and I thought to myself at the time, my mother was an Auschwitz, somebody else's mother was an Auschwitz. We couldn't possibly have anything in common. I thought that in the mid-70s, and it was only many years later I realized that we have so much in common. One of the major things being for most families that overprotection, and it continues, generation to generation. Now, you mentioned that your older brother, who is especially close to your grandparents, he absorbed a lot of their behaviors, including like a hyper awareness or what some people would call trauma driven thinking. Talk a little bit about that and how then you start to recognize some of those patterns in yourself.
Yeah, so there was always this notion in my house growing up that you had to finish the food on your plate, and that wasn't passed down from my parents. That was passed from my grandparents directly to my brother, and he was the one who spread notions like that in the house. And I mean, I'm trying to think of all the stories with him in particular. Um, uh, for example, at some point, we recently had a family heritage trip to Poland, and he had decided that although he had visited Auschwitz several times, that he couldn't go again because he had already been so traumatized by it, but was really pushing his children, who were much too young to go, because he wanted them to experience that. And he was also the brother who spoke Yiddish, and he insisted on learning Yiddish, and he would go. He still, I should say, he still goes on and on speaking Yiddish, trying to get me to speak the language, saying things like, "I don't want this to be Hitler's final victory." In other words, the death of the Yiddish language, which
Mm.
is a challenge. um, and so he has a lot of these um, nuances or behaviors or comments that one wouldn't expect from someone in their 50s who was born that many years after the Holocaust. Like I said, this paranoia about leaving food behind, this need to speak Yiddish even when no one can understand him, and this going on and on about we have to speak Yiddish because Hitler can't win. And this is something I grew up with and I continue to experience. My experience has been very different, as you mentioned, in light of modern events. My called transgenerational trauma has manifested itself a little bit differently, but I always grew up in a home where, from my grandparents when they were still alive, and eventually from my brother, this notion of you need to take what you have with you to be safe because who knows what will be later,
Now,
was always
you're
lived.
you're talking about the finishing everything on the plate that you said that didn't come from your parents. It came from your grandparents. Tell me about your parents. What did you notice either then at the time when you were young? What did you notice about them that was different from other parents?
Um, so so my mother was the descendant of her parents who were survivors, and the experience, and this might tie into why things went from my grandparents to my brother and entered the house through them. My mother had a lot of resentment towards my grandparents, and I wonder if she either didn't understand their trauma or was actively trying to fight against it and sort of convince herself or them that the world was a different place. And so there was always a lot of tension there. And when my grandparents used to try to educate us a certain way or take care of us a certain way, my mother used to be very confrontational with them. And so that was actually my experience in that front.
In terms of being confrontational, it's like, was there a battle about who that your grandparents thought maybe your parents weren't protective enough?
No, it was the other way around. My mother felt that they were too protective, too paranoid,
Right.
too inappropriate in their behavior. The story that like we sort of tell in the family that was a manifestation of that was in his early 20s, I think it was my uncle on the same side, wanted to visit Europe, and my grandparents would never go to Europe. That was like impossible to even think of. And he knew that they were so scared of that notion, even though Europe was a very different place at that time. He waited to get there and then sent them a letter or called them from Europe to say, I'm in Europe for 2 months, by the way, because he couldn't cope with them before the trip.
How did you feel that? Not you mentioned your grandparents seemed a bit different from other grandparents. What about your parents? Did your parents seem different from parents who were not second gen?
It's a tough question. I was, you know, um, first of all, a lot of my parents' friends were second gen.
Uh,
So I don't know what my basis of comparison was. Um, not to a greater degree than any other family, variation between families, not that I could ever feel. And again, I think there was the opposite. There was like a rebellion against the notion of the trauma. And so there were things that we wouldn't talk about, and that didn't come up. I think they deliberately didn't come up.
Now, what about up to after October 7th, when so many things shifted for so many people? How did that change you, your thinking, your brother's thinking, and your parents' thinking?
Yeah, that was a big one for me, especially. It's triggering. So maybe foolishly, or in hindsight, I think it was foolishly. I talked a little bit about how my parents or my mother was often angry at my grandparents and was pushing this notion of the world is a different place and Europe is a safe place, and this notion that my grandparents were a bit crazy and they were overly protective. And
Mm.
October 7th flipped that narrative like 180 degrees, at least for me. And I guess I was always raised, as I mentioned, in a house where I was taught that there might be something unsafe just around the corner as a Jew. Um, and I was taught or I learned to reject that idea, to not believe. We're in the modern world and this horrific anti-Semitism that used to exist is a thing of the past. And October 7th changed that, not a little bit, profoundly. And a lot of friends and me were chatting after that, and one of the things um, that I remember saying to a lot of people was, we have a collective memory of another time in history where Jews were killed, and everyone said, "What's the problem? Why are you not okay with that?" And that was one of the first that just embodied the way I felt about what was going on. It suddenly felt like the world was attacking Jews and we needed to be okay with it. And I remember saying there was this like deep visceral feeling that I had that was not mine. I called it our collective memory of
Right.
another time something like that happened and other people were okay with it. Or another time Jews were attacked and other parts of the world started attacking Jews and saying that it was Jews' fault and things like that. And this sense of security that I had in general in life, and I mean a global sense of security, like I'm safe regardless of where I am. And I think it was a delusional sense, or now I think it was delusional, that was wiped away. And one of the most difficult places that I felt that erosion of my global sense of security was as a father, thinking, what do I teach my children? What do I say to my children? I don't think I'm safe, and I don't think they're safe. Particularly
Right.
traveling to Canada afterwards became very scary for me. But my children have friends in Canada, and they have family in Canada. They love traveling to Canada, and I made the conscious decision to not share those feelings with them because I didn't want to erode their sense of safety in the world.
Right.
Uh, but in all honesty, I don't think we're safe, and I don't think they're safe. And I think if anything connected me to that feeling that my grandparents might have had of they don't think the world's a safe place, but it's a scarier thing to pass that on to your children, it was that particular feeling of I don't think we're safe, I don't think they're safe, but I don't want to burden them with that feeling.
Chosen for What is brought to you by the Foundation for Genocide Education. To learn more or to make a donation, head to gened.org. You'll find the link in the show notes. And now, back to the podcast.
As a general rule, my mother taught me that all people are bad, period. Let's start there. All people are bad. And every now and then, there will be exceptions. The people I knew who were not second gen, who were born in Canada, whose parents did not experience the Holocaust at all, they think the other way around. Everyone is wonderful, and every now and then you bump into somebody who is not good or is a bad person. I think that comes with second gen. In other words, that when you're descended from Holocaust survivors, the notion that everyone is bad with exceptions makes perfect sense. And I think that stays with you, even if, we weren't there, we're second gen, or in your case, third gen.
Yeah, so it's similar. I would put it a little bit differently. I only feel safe within my community. And so, and I know this from my family in Montreal, who described to me that the Montreal Jewish community has become very insular. And I'm a believer in, you know, striving for world peace and brotherhood of man, and all people should get along with each other and have tolerance. But since October 7th, my general feeling is when I'm within a Jewish community, I have a sense of safety. And when I'm interacting with people outside the Jewish community, I don't feel safe, or I don't know if I can feel safe.
I think part of the reason is that it's no longer, you have a different political opinion. They're making the political opinion of defending Israel an unacceptable opinion, and dehumanizing somebody who feels that way.
Yeah.
And I've heard so many cases of this being repeated over and over again. My parents told me, to be careful, it can happen again. And I said, come on, don't be silly. Don't be ridiculous. No, it can't. That was then, this is now. And so many second gen people, literally, sometimes they can apologize to their parents if they're still around. In many cases, they're not around anymore. They can apologize, saying they were right. It can happen again. Let's hope it doesn't, but it can, in terms of seeing the I guess tsunami of anti-Semitism unleashed around the world after October 7th. I think you can't help but have that feeling of safety gone. That feeling of safety that was there for some people is no longer there.
Yeah. What you said is exactly what I feel. I don't know how to say it any better than you just did. It's that feeling of it can't happen again. It suddenly feels like, oh no, everyone's okay with it. Like it's fine. And and to add to what you said, it's I don't necessarily know how I'm being judged by other people, but that's exactly it. I don't know. And until someone explicitly turns to me and says, we feel for you, we support you, etc., I assume that that person doesn't support me, or doesn't feel for me, or doesn't understand my experience. And so it's similar to what you were saying. I assume outside of my own community that people are against me unless they prove otherwise to me. And I think that that's very similar to what you were saying.
Now, you mentioned that someone who lives in Jerusalem, you now feel more anxiety traveling abroad, especially to places like Canada. I've heard the discussion from people in Israel saying, it's terrible. You get out of Canada, get out of the United States, get to Israel. But the truth of the matter is, the bare facts on the ground are more Jews have been killed in Israel than any other country. Right after what happened on October 7th. And I hear the argument, yes, but there's an Israeli army to protect us. But in terms of the level of safety and danger, there's a level of danger, obviously, in Israel as well as there is in the diaspora. Don't you agree with that?
So it's ironic, and my wife and I don't see eye to eye on this. But it's ironic that I feel safer. I feel personally safer living in a war zone than I do being in Canada. And
Unbelievable.
what you're saying is factually correct. But I guess my fear in Canada is that I never know where the danger is, and I don't know how to protect myself against it. And I don't know if they come for me, if anyone's going to do anything about it. And I mean, the news out of Montreal, at least, is ripe with examples. I recall November 2023, I was in Montreal for a conference, and my friends who were attending this conference with me kept not talking to me about the news in Montreal because I was talking to them about how unsafe I felt. And then that afternoon, I said, "Well, did you see a synagogue was firebombed today?" And they all sort of hung their heads and said, "We saw it, but we were hoping you hadn't seen it." And then the next day, a daycare was shot at overnight. No one was there. It was overnight.
Right.
And I said, "Well, you see, and that's why I feel unsafe here." And they said, "Again, we saw it and we were hoping you hadn't seen it. So we didn't bring it up because they knew I wasn't feeling safe." And one of the things that was striking was beyond the fact that these events were happening in Montreal, it was the fact that the official statements coming out of the police were things like, "Well, we don't have any proof that this is a hate crime," or
Right.
"We're concerned about the manner in which we investigate it because that might have repercussions and cause a back and forth, which will cause escalation. So we'd rather just calm things down." And these were the type of answers we were getting. Whereas in Israel, um, I agree, like so many people were killed on October 7th, and it was a scary time, but the military moved two military battalions into my neighborhood just to protect the population and make sure we're all already safe. And it's true there was a direct threat for us, but it was the devil, like we knew where the danger was coming from, and B, the fact that the government was openly protecting us instead of saying things like, "Well, let's not rock the boat," or things that are happening now, like, "Well, maybe it was a provoked attack," or things like that. And so, again, what you're saying in terms of loss of life in Israel is factually correct, but it doesn't change the sense that when I'm under threat, I want to feel protected by my government, not that my government might be making excuses, condoning, allowing it to happen.
Let's talk about that resilience. I was intrigued when my father, who was a Holocaust survivor, he was in Mauthausen, when he went to Israel, and he was a rabbi, so I was curious. He went to visit his sister who lived there. I was curious, and I asked him, like, what was the most profound thing for you about visiting Israel? What had the most meaning for you? So I remembered in my case, it was, when I was on Israeli soil at the airport, the tarmac, like, surrounded by all these hostile countries. Here's Israel in the middle of it. And this land, this tarmac is Israel. So that's what it was for me. It wasn't that for him. It wasn't seeing his sister, though he's very happy to see his sister. It wasn't the Wailing Wall. All the things that I guessed at, I was wrong. And what it was, he said, and this is a guy who survived, the Holocaust and Mauthausen and then the Hungarian Revolution after. He said it was the soldiers. He said the fact that when I saw soldiers with guns, that the guns were not pointed at me, that they were on my side. When I saw people in your uniform, not coming to arrest me, but here to protect me, that's what moved him the most. And I found that intriguing, given the fact he was
Yeah.
a Holocaust survivor. Uh, uh, in terms of the trauma that we deal with, yes, there's the fear that goes with it, but I think what we also inherited from them is the resilience and the ability to survive. We can survive all kinds of things. I remember when COVID happened, I thought, what are people complaining about? They're worried about like COVID and you have to lock yourself up and, you can't go to restaurants. You can't do these things. As inconveniences go, I said, compared to what our parents went through, I'm wondering, what's the next thing going to be on Netflix, or where am I going to order food from? It's going to be delivered instead of going out to get it. It gave us the strength to get through that. In other words, it helps us also get through tough things. Did you find that to be your experience and perhaps your brother's experience?
Yes and no. No, because again, there's this triggering, very visceral, very deeply ingrained event. I didn't have a way to process October 7th. Just saying I wasn't able to get to sleep for over a year. Really, that I had to,
Well,
both my wife and I would just sit in bed watching videos to distract ourselves until we eventually were exhausted and fell asleep. And the additional burden of not wanting to pass that on to our children, on the one hand. On the other hand, the experience of, rising from the ashes, um, turning a negative event into something stronger that makes you stronger is definitely something that, like I said earlier, it's somewhere in our collective memory. It's somewhere in our collective history. My wife was recently giving a talk at our local synagogue about, it was actually a talk on the last Holocaust Memorial Day about resilience. She's a psychotherapist. And she related a lot of our collective experience as Jews to her experiences working as a psychotherapist in Northern Canada with Canada's First Nations. And one of the things that the community members, our synagogue members, were very interested in was here we had Canada's First Nations who had also undergone a collective trauma, and they still haven't recovered from it. They're still very damaged.
right.
And on the other hand, we had our country, Israel, because she was giving this lecture at our synagogue, or this talk rather, at our synagogue in Jerusalem. And they said, and on the other hand, we underwent a collective experience referring to the Holocaust. I mean, currently referring to the Holocaust. You can keep going back and saying referring to the Spanish Inquisition, referring to, we can just keep peeling history back and back.
Right.
And each time we went through that, instead of becoming a beat down group, we used that experience to make ourselves stronger and eventually found a modern country.
I want to get back to what you said, that you're making a point. We've talked about your grandparents, your parents, and now you're making a point that you don't want to pass this fear or much of this trauma onto your children. How do you do that? What kind of things do you do to ensure that you do not pass this on to your children, to the next generation?
I should be more honest. I want to pass it on a little bit to the next generation.
Right.
Because I think, as I said, I dismissed it a lot growing up. Because I said that's not the world anymore. And I don't want them to live with the feeling that I have right now, which I think I will have for the rest of my life.
Mm-hmm.
So one of the big things, look, I don't want to become political here. I'm a left-wing Israeli, right? I am a big believer in the peace process and ultimately the fact that we all have to learn to coexist and find a way to build our neighbors up and to get along with them. After the trauma that my generation has gone through, I became fearful that we might not have the partners that I was growing up in a left-wing home that I was raised to believe we had. And the more I look into what's happening, the more I read and look into and watch what's happening in the world now, I'm worried that might be true, but I don't talk about that with my children. So as far I have to pass on those left-wing ideals, seeking out peaceful coexistence and building partners for peace, etc., regardless of if I believe it to be true or not. And I hope it's true. I'm just not sure anymore, because the alternative is just, it's unacceptable to say, okay, so we'll just live in perpetual war, fear of violence, and lack of coexistence. That's just not an option. And so I tell what I think of as a small lie, but it might be a very big lie that that the world ultimately wants to be a better place and humanity wants to live in brotherhood. And my hope is that if we continue to advocate that, whether we believe it or not, we can make it true.
Do you find that some of the people who share your left-leaning views, some of them have moved to the right, if not to the right, to more to the center
Um,
because of not having
uh,
that partner they'd hoped to have?
yeah, no, I've moved more to the right.
Right.
The left wing in Israel has moved globally to the right, just like the left wing unfortunately in Canada and the US has become more extreme in recent years. Um, I need to figure out how I redefine myself as a lefty, but part of it is continuing to advocate and work towards ultimate peace and coexistence, regardless of my personal sense of can that really happen and are we really secure?
Thank you so much, Dr. Goldstein, for sharing your experience so openly. Your reflections offer a powerful reminder that intergenerational trauma doesn't always shout. Sometimes it can whisper, it can shape and linger in unexpected ways. If you liked what you heard today, please like, follow, subscribe, and share this episode. And if you would like to support the work of the Foundation for Genocide Education, you can find a link to make a donation in the show notes. For the Foundation for Genocide Education, I'm Tommy Schnurmacher. Until next time.